From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Thanks for joining us. First off today, we'll bring back in from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen. Roger will name his top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments of 2020, and he'll outline the importance of each of these to you agricultural producers and the agriculture industry as a whole. Included on the list, several court rulings on such things as the Public Trust Doctrine and the Dormant Commerce Clause. Also listed, a favorable ruling for farmers on USDA farm records and the Freedom of Information Act. We'll cover all of that and more with Roger next. And awaiting with another Stop, Look, and Listen is K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven. Plus more here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome once again to Agriculture Today, our Wednesday edition. Glad to have you aboard. 2 weeks ago today, we visited with our guest now about his almost top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments of the year 2020. And we promised at that time to get to the real thing, the top 10 list of such. And that's what we do today. As aboard with us is Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. Roger, no 2 years are alike. We all understand that. But 2020, broadly speaking, actually, had its own unique twists and turns in just about every aspect, including what we'll talk about today.
That's putting it mildly, yes. 2020 was unique in many ways, and the legal issues were different than any other year, and they'll be different in 21 than they were in 20. There are some themes that come back over and over because some issues are cyclical, particularly financial type and economic type issues tend to be cyclical throughout the ag economy. But the legal issues ebb and flow and sometimes conjoin with those economic issues.
Well, let's get right to your list, and we'll do it in reverse order. Number 10 on that list, well, the Department of Justice has announced an investigation of meat packers and price manipulation. What happened this past year?
Well, in May of 2020, President Trump asked the U.S. Department of Justice to investigate the pricing practices of the major meat packers, and there were 11 state attorneys general that also asked the Department of Justice to do the same thing. And they were pointing out in their request that the 4 largest beef processors in the United States control 80% of U.S. beef processing. And according to USDA data, boxed beef prices in 2020, during the time frame they were looking at, more than doubled. Simultaneously, live cattle prices dropped about 20%. So the concern was that the meat packers were engaged in price manipulation and other practices that were deemed unfair under federal law. So we'll see what happens. If the investigation is actually conducted by the Department of Justice, results could occur that would be very positive to livestock producers and consumers throughout the nation. But we'll see what happens.
That is number 10 on Roger's list. Number 9 for 2020. Well, this got into the taxation of arrangements that are called conservation easements.
Well, this is a popular technique for some landowners, particularly landowners, farm and ranch land that might be along a scenic river, scenic corridor. And what this allows a taxpayer to do, there's a provision in the Internal Revenue Code that says if you put a permanent easement on your property and donate that to a qualified charity, basically a land trust. And in Kansas, we have land trusts that will accept these, or qualified charities that can accept these. Then you can claim a charitable deduction on your tax return for the decrease in the value of your property as a result of that restriction in use. Now, the problem is IRS is all over this, and there are very, very specific rules in the Internal Revenue Code that must be followed to get that charitable deduction. The IRS examines every one of these, and during 2020, At its height, the tax court had over 150 cases involving conservation easements on its docket. And the Commissioner of IRS in 2020 stated that they will look at every one of these to see if it comports with the code. So you've got to be very, very careful on these. These involve a lot of agricultural land across the country, but beware. IRS is looking at these very, very closely.
Number 8 on your list, and this one touches a nerve with many an agricultural producer, the privacy of USDA farm records. Thankfully, a favorable court ruling for producers, you say, in 2020.
We did get a favorable trial court ruling in the Federal District Court for the District of Columbia in late November, just after Thanksgiving, on this issue. And, of course, farmers disclose a lot of information and data to the USDA to be able to participate in federal farm programs. And that information or data is often tied to the particular farmer and the farm location. So that raises privacy concerns, of course, over who has access to that data, what entities have access to that data. And in the telematch case that went to the Federal District Court in D.C., the court pointed out, well, there are a couple of major exceptions to the Freedom of Information Act requests that people can file to get information. That's the law that requires the federal government to disclose certain documents upon request. And basically the court said that farm-specific or individual-specific data can breach privacy concerns, and that's protected by the Constitution. Your privacy rights are protected in that instance. And so USDA doesn't have to disclose that type of information. And so that was the big, I think, take-home that came out of that case. That case is on appeal. Just shortly before Christmas, Telematch, the firm that was seeking all of this data, did file an appeal in that case. So that one probably will remain a live issue in 21, but farmers need to remember that there are some exceptions and some really important ones from disclosing all types of data under a FOIA request.
It's always good to chalk up a win for agriculture. That was such the case there. Number 7, Natural Resources Conservation Service, writing a final rule on conservation provisions and, in essence, interpretation of those provisions. What was this about, Roger?
Well, Eric, in late 2018, the USDA put out a new interim rule concerning conservation provisions, and that final rule was published in August of 2020. And what it did, and this is really important for farmers and ranchers and landowners all across the country, it added definitions for wetland hydrology, normal climatic conditions, and best drain condition. And it also modified the manner in which NRCS delineates or determines the various types of wetland. And it states that wetland determinations that were made between 1990 and 96 are to be certified so that USDA benefits will not be denied if the farmer conducts farming activities on land that is covered by a certification. Now, that's all fine, as stated, but when you actually look at the regulations, that's where I think there are really some major concerns for landowners. On the delineations, there's no clarification of the rule, I don't think, as much as it alters how the NRCS makes those determinations to make the process more convenient for them, and making appeals from that convenient, simplified process more difficult for farmers and ranchers. And it's a step away from scientific determination of wetland hydrology and regularly cropped farmland. It really doesn't carry out what the court required coming out of a significant case in Nebraska that was decided by the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals in 1999. And we'll have to watch to see in actuality how it's going to be implemented in 2021.
So worthy of a heads up to our producers on that. And before we take a break, number 6 on your list, this applies to individual state regulations on out-of-state production agricultural practices and whether the dormant commerce clause should apply in those situations.
That's right. The Commerce Clause under the U.S. Constitution gives the Congress the power to regulate commerce among the states. And when it doesn't specifically limit a state's power, and the Constitution doesn't, it doesn't make any comments with respect to specific limitations on a state's power to regulate commerce. But the U.S. Supreme Court has long interpreted the Commerce Clause as an implicit restraint on state authority, even if there's no conflicting federal statute. So the basic precept when the Constitution was ratified was that the country was a single economic union and that states gave up their sovereign power to impose tariffs and restrain interstate commerce. That was kind of the deal. You get to be part of the union, but you can't regulate each other. We're all one United States. It is the Congress that imposes economic regulation on interstate commerce. Well, under the Dormant Commerce Clause, a state cannot enact any rules or regulations that would affirmatively discriminate against the economic production of goods in another state without some type of legitimate local justification for doing so. Now, all that sounds, a lot of legalese and so forth, but there's a direct application and a very important one to what is going on in the courts with respect to agriculture. And this is why this makes number 6 on my list. And the primary concern here is California, although some other states have done this. But this really came to a head over the past few years and in 2020 with what California has been doing in creating rules, legislation that says if you want to sell ag products in our state, those products have to be raised in a manner that we deem to be socially acceptable. And so basically what California is saying is with respect to confinement structures or cages that birds are raised in, laying hens, they have to be of a certain size. They have to be able to get up, stand around, turn around. I call it the hokey pokey law. You have to be able to turn around and do the hokey pokey. And if your confinement structure is large enough to do that, then you can sell your eggs in California. Well, the question is, can California really do that? Can they dictate the agricultural practices that are to be regulated by those states if those producers want to sell in the California market? And in 2020, the federal court said, yeah, they can do that. Now, those cases remain in the court system. There's a different California case challenging one of those propositions in California that became law, and it continues on. But that's really serious stuff. If one state can dictate their rules upon another state, where does it end?
Well, several impactful things in the first half of Roger's top 10 list of agricultural law and taxation developments of 2020. We'll finish the countdown with numbers 5 through 1 after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, Amber Alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, as is our featured guest, Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation out of the Washburn University School of Law. We're halfway through Roger's top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments in the year 2020. We're around to, Roger, number 5 on your list, and this, no shock to anyone that it did make the list. The issue of dicamba drift, which has sparked any number of court actions.
Yeah, it sure has. This has been going on for a few years now because there have been changes in the formulation of dicamba, which is a major chemical that is used in agriculture to control various types of weeds. It's very volatile if it's not used exactly, precisely, and under the right conditions. And we had a major case. We got a jury verdict in early 2020 involving Missouri's largest peach farming operation. And the jury returned a $265 million judgment against Monsanto, Bayer, and BASF, with $15 million of that compensatory damages and $250 million being punitive damages. This is huge. We just don't see those types of damages in drift cases, but this was monstrous. And that litigation continued throughout 2020 with the issue being, were those damages calculated correctly? And basically, on appeal, the court said, yes, it was calculated correctly. The trial court upheld a $15 million compensatory damage award, but there was a notice of appeal filed very late in December, just before Christmas in this case. So it will continue. It will continue to be in the news, and it will be an issue in 21. But from a broader perspective, this is a nationwide type issue because it teaches us how damages are computed in these cases. And the impact of this is, while concentrated primarily in the center part of the country, we have ramifications from this evidenced all over the country.
Number 4, groundwater discharge and the Clean Water Act and a court ruling with potentially huge repercussions for production agriculture, it would seem, Roger.
Oh, boy, as we climb up the ladder, these things get bigger and bigger in their importance to farmers and ranchers and rural landowners and agribusiness, and this one is huge. This is a U.S. Supreme Court opinion that came down in 2020. It's a result of 3 different U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals opinions in 2018 that reached 2 different results. And what's happening here involves groundwater and whether you need a federal NPDES permit under the Clean Water Act to discharge a pollutant into groundwater. Well, the Clean Water Act says that you don't. You don't have to have a federal permit because groundwater is regulated at the state level. So you've got to go through the state rules that apply in your particular state. Well, the question came up in a case that the U.S. Supreme Court took from the Ninth Circuit. It's a Hawaii fact-based case where there was a direct discharge into groundwater, but it ultimately seeped into the Pacific Ocean. And the question became, well, shouldn't you have a permit in that instance where the pollutant actually does get into a water of the United States, which would require a federal permit, even though that wasn't the injection point? And the U.S. Supreme Court came up with this kind of amorphous test, and I don't like it when they do this. They said, well, maybe not. If the groundwater discharge is the functional equivalent of a direct discharge into a WOTUS, then you have to have a permit. And what that tells me, Eric, is that we're going to end up litigating every one of these cases because there's no bright line standard. And in fact, the dissent in the Supreme Court case pointed that out. And basically saying that when you create these types of rules, maybe it would be great majority if you could come up with a precise standard rather than, as Justice Alito said, some nebulous standard and then simply buck passing to the lower courts on the issue. I think a quote of Alito is key on this, and this is important to landowners that are regulated. He said, quote, if the court is going to devise its own legal rules, instead of interpreting those enacted by Congress, it might at least adopt rules that can be applied with a modicum of consistency, end quote. I think that's well said. Functional equivalency test is going to be a real booger for landowners to deal with when you have groundwater discharges.
Then to number 3. This was a decision by the Supreme Court of the United States as well. It's on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, regulations, and an opinion that may not seem by its name as having relevance to agriculture, but it definitely is so, you say, Roger?
Oh, I think it's huge, and it's not for why people may think it's big. I'm not talking about migrant workers on the farm, those types of things. This is a big issue because it involves the Administrative Procedures Act. DACA was created by an administrative agency acting at the direction of the president to create a rule. They didn't go through Congress. There's no congressional action that was taken. It was just an internal agency memorandum that was never exposed to the light of day under the Administrative Procedure Act. And President Trump came in and said, look, that is an illegal act. The program itself is not legal, and the courts have said so, so he ordered the agency to take it out. Well, that got challenged, and the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, said, you got to go through the Administrative Procedures Act to eliminate an illegal rule that was created illegally. And you scratch your head at that, and you think, well, wait a minute. The agency is trying to correct itself. It acted improperly in developing the rule in the first place. And now you're saying they can't eliminate it without going through the proper channels, and that's what they said. Well, this is important to us in agriculture because USDA has a penchant for creating all types of rules without ever going through the Administrative Procedure Act. IRS does this. Many will remember the CRP 20 years ago when IRS just out of thin air created their own rule and said all CRP payments are subject to self-employment tax. And that had to be litigated before the courts knocked it out and said, no, you didn't develop that rule properly. But if the Supreme Court is saying here, well, you don't have to go through the Administrative Procedure Act to create a rule. That can create all types of issues for us in agriculture because it doesn't expose these rules to the notice and comment procedures of the Administrative Procedures Act, where farmers, ranchers, lawyers, CPAs can see the proposed rule, comment on it, make it better, or eliminate it before it's finalized. That's the real trouble with this development that occurred in 2020.
Then to number 2. And it's about what's called the public trust doctrine. It relates to, in this case, the protection of natural resources. This is an emerging area of concern likewise for agriculture. How so?
Well, this one's huge. That's why it's at number 2. This will apply all over the country. Some courts have been asked to expand the reach of that doctrine to apply to minimum desirable stream flows for particular species that are in the stream, to upend state water law, to change vested water rights, to eliminate vested water rights because there's this greater environmental concern that's out there. That could be a material detrimental impact on farming and ranching operations. If you're using water, for example, to irrigate crops or to water livestock, then your rights could be eliminated or vastly diminished if this public trust doctrine is expanded. Fortunately, in 2020, we had a couple of significant state court cases at the Supreme Court level out of Nevada and Oregon where the court said, nope, we're not going to eliminate vested water rights in the Nevada case. We're not going to expand the doctrine, nor are we going to expand it in the Oregon case to cover natural resources.
But still bears monitoring. And, well, as folks have heard the last several minutes, numbers 10 through 2 on your list are rather important to extreme levels, in some cases to agriculture. Makes one wonder what was number 1. This has to do with the pandemic and the outflow of support programs as a result of it, and some tax provisions rolled out as well associated with it. How would you characterize all of that, Roger?
Well, in one word or 2 words, I would say a mess. But you're right. Number 1, clearly the biggest development is all of the legislation coming from the CARES Act, the various CFAP programs. There were 3 versions of these that were actually enacted, CFAP 1, 2, and 3, disaster legislation, all types of retirement law changes, just a lot of tax changes, all these loans, the issue of forgiveness of the loans. What a year with respect to all types of new stuff. Well, this time a year ago, I never dreamed of anything like this. A tremendous infusion of taxpayer dollars into the sector, which we don't have, by the way, which creates other economic issues. And there's talk of doing more of that. So, oh boy, this one clearly was the big one, and it's not just specific to ag, although it affects everybody in ag. Fortunately, we know ag is a very necessary business and just kept rolling right along. But the PPP loans, the idle grants and loans, all types of other issues, tax and non-tax and retirement planning, disaster legislation, clearly the number 1 development in 2020.
Well, there is Roger's top 10 agricultural law and taxation development list. And just to remind that these have been captured in full in Roger's write-up on his blog, and you can find that at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. Thank you for taking the time and putting in the effort to not only pull these items together, but covering those with us, Roger.
Thank you, Eric.
He is a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. As you know, Roger McEowen. We'll be back with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson with you. Before we get to today's agricultural news headlines, we here at the K-State Radio Network were deeply saddened to hear of the passing of one of our longtime agricultural broadcasting colleagues. Lori Williams, recently retired farm director for our affiliate in southwest Kansas, KBUF, passed away on Sunday at Wesley Medical Center in Wichita, this following an accident having occurred last week. Lori started her radio broadcasting career in Lamar, Colorado. She also worked in Boonville, Missouri, Oberlin, and Hayes here in Kansas, and back in Pueblo, Colorado, before arriving at Garden City and KBUF in 1986. Lori, always great to visit with and interact with professionally over the years. She was a member of the National Association of Farm Broadcasters, of course, and receiving many honors and awards from the NAFB through the years. Lori, loving and living the rural life, was involved in rodeos, in saddle club events, 4-H, Beef Empire Days, and was heavily involved in her favorite charity, Miles of Smiles. That's a therapeutic riding program located in Garden City. Our greatest condolences to her husband, Roy Johnson, and Lori's large family. Funeral services will be at 10:30 tomorrow morning at the Church of the Brethren in Garden City. Lori Williams, a true friend of Kansas agriculture, and she is greatly missed. The outgoing Trump administration granted 3 pending requests for small refinery exemptions to the renewable fuel standard for 2018 and 19 last evening. According to the EPA, the agency did not decide on the remaining 30 requests for 2019. In addition, the EPA granted 1 additional request for 2018 and increased the total number of exemption requests from 14 to 15 for this past year. The Renewable Fuels Association said in a statement last evening that group will challenge the EPA's decision. The RFA said the 2 2019 exemptions will amount to another 150 million gallons of lost renewable fuel demand. The 2018 exemption expected to result in a loss of 110 million gallons of biofuel demand, according to the RFA. That was previously denied by the agency. A federal appeals court ruled last year the agency has illegally granted exemptions to 3 refiners in 2016. An appeal by refiners in that case will be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. And JBS has reached a settlement in an ongoing class action lawsuit that alleges JBS, along with several other large meat companies, conspired to raise the price of pork. According to the settlement preliminary approved by the U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota last week, JBS will pay $24 million in monetary relief and will agree to cooperate with the direct purchaser plaintiffs in the case against other pork companies. Other defendants in the case include Hormel Foods, Seaboard Foods, Smithfield Foods, Triumph Foods, and Tyson Foods. Now, back in 2018, several plaintiffs alleged in a complaint that the companies entered into a conspiracy from at least 2009 to the present to, as they put it, fix, raise, maintain, and stabilize the price of pork by coordinating their output and limiting production. The settlement class covers anyone who bought pork directly from JBS or other defendants in the lawsuit, starting on January the 1st of 2009 and continuing to the date of the settlement. The USDA is lowering its expectations for meat production in most categories, meantime. Here's more on that from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
World Ag Outlook Board Chair Mark Jekanowski says USDA made mostly minor changes on its meat supply and use balance sheet for 2020.
Looking forward into 2021 with the tighter supplies, especially of corn and soybeans, and much higher prices that are expected to follow from that, we expect that will show up in some reduced expectations for meat production.
So as a result,
we pulled back our forecasts for both broiler and turkey production. We also pulled back our forecast for beef production, and that reflects in part lighter carcass weights.
He says the only increase expected for 2021 is in pork production.
That reflects the data that we got last month in the hogs and pigs report, and also the slaughter data that we've been observing, suggesting that pork supplies are likely to increase. But even there, the increase in pork production forecast is relatively small.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And the USDA has published its final rule to be the framework for the U.S. hemp industry. The 301-page package includes some changes from an October 2019 interim final rule that provided initial guidelines to implement the 2018 Farm Bill, which removed hemp from the Controlled Substances Act. The finished regulations come after 5,900 public comments and letters from members of Congress. The final rule package takes effect on March the 22nd and will provide steps for the USDA to review and approve plans submitted by state, territorial, and tribal governments for regulating hemp production. The rules also lay out how the department will regulate farmers in states that have not outlawed hemp but also have not submitted plans. Under the final rule, farmers will not be labeled as negligent if test samples of their hemp crop register at 0.5% THC on a dry weight basis. The regulation would put the negligent threshold at 1% THC. Being declared negligent 3 out of 5 years could result in the producer being barred from hemp production for 5 years. Now, the hemp industry was arguing that given the volatile nature of THC in hemp plants, that a producer who followed all the rules could still exceed that 0.5% threshold. The rule would also allow producers with crops that test above 0.3% THC to continue to dispose of the so-called hot plants by plowing the plants under to amend the soil, by cutting and blending the plants with manure or other material to make compost, and by burning the plants. The options allow farmers to get some use out of the plants or avoid more costly methods of destruction. And one quick calendar reminder, the final of the K-State 2021 beef calving schools taking place tomorrow evening. Now, this program, to remind, will outline overall calving management, including stages of the calving process and tips for handling difficult calving situations. It'll include that life-size cow and calf model, and it is set for tomorrow in Dodge City. For more information on it, contact the Ford County Extension Office right away. Andrea Burns there, aburns@ksu.edu, or you can go to ksubeef.org to follow up on this final K-State Beef Calving School for the season. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
Of course, it is a crazy or silly thought.
That's Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Sometimes people's character reminds me of our landscapes. I'm not thinking of only Kansas landscapes. No, I'm thinking of our country, the United States of America. And I'm thinking of all our people. Of course it is a crazy or silly thought, but think about it. Every now and then you meet a rugged, strong personality, and then I think of our mountain landscape. Such a person can dress the part, but not necessarily so. Just like our mountains, he or she can be a quiet person with deep, steady thoughts, like deep valleys or sudden canyons. The valleys are wide and smoother, productive. The canyons more sudden, maybe more abrasive and more difficult to penetrate. Deeper thoughts might be more explosive, more solitude. Of course, our landscapes have been partly created by our climate. Storms and rushing rains, cold and heat have had influences. So have our characters been influenced. Like any landscape, vegetation adds character. I'm not talking about beards or long hair, but again, it is character. We have in the far northwest the deep, dark forest. When the rain blows in from the sea, the trees are misty, and moisture is all about making things grow. Silent, somber, and dark. It can be beautiful and mysterious. In the mountains on top, you can look far, sometimes farther than you can see. The same with people. Some landscapes are extremely productive. They are landscapes producing wheat, corn, and other crops. They are like the steady people doing their task. There can be storms roaring across those landscapes, and the storms can leave scars. But generally, the wide open landscapes stay productive. Crops are produced year after year. They are steady people. They know what to do and what is expected from them, and they do it. If there's aversion, they know how to handle it and help each other. It's an old landscape with long old history, and it has seen changes. The changes have formed the characters of the people. They're quiet people, making communities. They are surely not plain, but steady, and it is the steadiness which gives them strong characters. We have landscapes with volcano actions. It can be explosive. There always seems to be tension. One never knows. Sometimes it comes at a boiling point and characters explode, sometimes with disastrous results. It's not easy to be such a landscape. You don't know what can happen. It's unpredictable, yet it can be beautiful. The process of healing for such a landscape can take time. In the process we learn, but things can be destroyed. It's hard. It takes a lot of time to heal. There are landscapes which are hard to enter. I'm thinking of swamps. They are dangerous landscapes, and only the people who know can or should enter. There are characters like that. They may be hard to deal with. Maybe they're misunderstood. Maybe we don't try hard enough to understand them. When we alter the landscape and drain the swamp, we may be destroying something. There are people like deserts who bloom after rain squall. All of a sudden, dry, desolate land turns colorful. Those are people who are encouraged when loved and respond. The thing I've learned by looking at many landscapes is that all landscapes are connected and that they slowly or more rapidly flow from one into the other. That can be very interesting. We know and recognize the edge effect in landscapes, and we know that edges are the most diverse landscape and often the richest. Maybe that's where the artists are. There may be poets, painters. They may be very creative people, maybe autistic. You can think where the plains meet the mountains or sea, oceans meet land. Ask yourself, where does land meet swamp? Think about the bayous near the mouth of our big rivers. And that brings up another thought. How many landscapes have we destroyed? Sometimes we have destroyed out of ignorance, and sometimes willingly. It's the same with characters of people. It might have taken generations, as it will take many generations to heal. If all this sounds kind of philosophical or weird, just think about it as you do your daily chores or work. Look around you and ask yourself where you feel happy or where you long for. It may surprise you as you look at yourself. It may help you understand yourself. But just like land and landscape, we are all attached. We flow from one into the other. Yes, I'm aware there are islands, and there are people who are totally themselves. As an island, they have their own character. They can be different. They are no better or worse. They are an island. They are unique. Those people may be hesitant to come ashore, but remember, we're all still connected, just as the rock core of the land is still connected deep under the water. Sometimes not so deep, but we are connected. People are like landscapes. I sometimes wonder what my landscape is. I'm still trying to find out.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. He's featured every Wednesday right here. Well, looking ahead to tomorrow's broadcast, we'll have for you information that was presented at K-State's Cover Your Acres Winter Conference yesterday. This on the water use of weeds in our crop fields. Work done by Jordan Bell of Texas A&M University that really gives a perspective on the value of effective weed control in our dry land crop production systems, especially where moisture is in short supply. Also, we'll hear from K-State's Ignacio Ciampiti. He'll tell us about a series of K-State corn management schools coming up, the first of which is set for tomorrow evening. That and more for you right here tomorrow. Please be back with us then, won't you? In the meantime, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.